Hello. Tonight on Free Thinking, we're travelling east to find out about al-Qaeda's best hidden weapon, classical Arabic poetry. Over the past few years, we've got used to the propaganda of Middle Eastern groups who advocate militant jihad, not ordinary religious struggle, which is what jihad really means, but instead slick and sick videos and ranting blog posts. But Elisabeth Kendall, author of 21st Century Jihad, thinks we've missed one of al-Qaeda's most important vehicles for inciting militant terror, the adaptation of classical Arabic poetry for a very modern and terrifying message. One of the sources of that poetry is an online magazine published out of Yemen called Sada el-Malahim. When I talked to Liz Kendall earlier, I asked her what sort of magazine this was, presumably not the kind that has recipes and knitting patterns.
Oh, it does actually have some recipes in it. The whole point of this magazine is that it is an attempt to propagandise the jihad as part of life. So whilst our various intelligence services might be busy translating all the doctrinal material and the theological material, what would grab people on the ground is the whole wealth of material relating to family life. So there's a women's section dedicated to try to bring wives on side with the jihad, wives and daughters. There's a sort of births, marriages, deaths section, some memoirs of how I joined the jihad, some testimonials, and there's an awful lot of poetry.
Well, poetry, of course, is at the centre of what we want to talk about, and I'd like you to give us an example of the kind of jihadist poetry that's published in this magazine.
Well, the kind of jihadist poetry that resonates most is the type of poetry that is modelled on the classical heritage, the classical literary heritage. The poems typically come in 2 half lines per verse, and they have a monorhyme. That means that the end of each verse ends in the same letter. Sometimes also the same consonantal sound. So the rhyme would be just one single rhyme all the way through a poem. That's very much a classical model of poetry. And poets today outside the jihad movement might poo-poo it a little bit. They might think, oh, this is very has-been. But of course, originality is not the point. The point is to try to put your agenda, your militant jihadist agenda, onto an authentic historical pedigree.
I think we need an example of what we're talking about here so that we can get an idea of what this poetry sounds like.
من لي بمثل فوارس من نوعهم لا يرتدون الذل والإرجاء لم يشهد الميدان مثل صنيعهم أسدا ضمادا خاضت الحجاء. I think that's sufficient to catch the lilt.
And what do those lines mean?
Where is the like of knights like them, who do not accept being humiliated and put off? The battlefield has never witnessed an act such as theirs, a wounded lion plunged into the battle. Those verses, I think, are quite typical. It posits the jihadists as knights and as lions, and it really posits what happened to those about whom the poem is being written, these jihadists, as martyrs who have died in a glorious, epic battle.
What period is this that the material is based on?
Actually, the material can go all the way back to pre-Islamic times.
Maybe the 5th, 6th century AD.
Yes, exactly. But these kinds of themes lasted all the way through. There wasn't quite the same kind of concept of originality that we have today. It was much more important to perfect existing themes than it was to create new ideas and new ways of expressing yourself.
So are the structures of writing very rigid? I mean, to get an idea of someone sitting down in a house in Yemen, which is, where most of this material comes from, I mean, what is the process of composition? Are people consciously taking these classical examples and then sort of filling in the blanks?
I think there are 2 things going on. They're taking what they already know from the oral heritage that's been passed down to them and just building on it. And there are some excellent examples by the former leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Nasser al-Wahayshi, also known as Abu Basir. He was killed actually this summer by a drone strike. But he basically took lines from the classical heritage and would then put a couple of new verses, graft them onto it. It would mean that listeners had something with which they were faintly familiar.
So based on an original idea by...
Yes, exactly. And then he could suddenly put a modern message on it. So, for example, he'd say, well, so are you going to join the jihad or not? Having just stated a couple of lines from a pre-Islamic poet that would be talking about the glories of war and fighting on behalf of the tribe. But what's most amazing about this is that because the poetry is not generally acknowledged, it's not generally confessed that these lines belong to somebody else from the past, I don't think in many instances that today's jihadists are aware that much of what they take is from the pre-Islamic heritage.
So who is the target audience? Who's actually listening to and being propagandised by this material?
Locals.
This is in Yemen, for instance.
Yemen, for instance, yes. Local Arab audiences who have grown up hearing this kind of material. And that's partly why we, as in our government agencies, have not really been paying much attention, because we're far more focused on slick productions like film and videos and the horror and brutality of the kind of materials, for example, that Islamic State is producing. Whereas on the ground, I think the poetry has a much greater role in grabbing people.
You did, I believe, what to me sounds like a fairly hair-raising piece of fieldwork in which you interviewed around 2,000 people in Yemen about how they reacted to this poetry. And I'm wondering again a bit more, who is it? Old, young, male, female, poor, rich? I mean, what is the demographic audience within that group in Yemen for this kind of poetry?
As you say, I asked over 2,000 tribesmen and tribeswomen how important they thought poetry was in their daily lives. I didn't ask them specifically about jihadist poetry because that would have been far too dangerous and they probably wouldn't have answered honestly. But 74% overall said that poetry played either an important or very important role in their daily lives. Now, when I broke that answer down further, I discovered that it was largely men. And it was largely men from a desert environment, slightly more than a sedentary community environment. And this might not be relevant, but that they tended to have more guns.
Although that says something interesting about masculinity in that culture, doesn't it? Because while, obviously we have lots of very masculine poets, Ted Hughes, the new biography has been in the news in the last few weeks. The fact is that the general assumption about a poet in liberal Western society, if it's a man, is that he's going to be, relatively sensitive, perhaps more feminine qualities. That doesn't appear to be the case in Yemen.
That's exactly right. It's not the case.
Do we have any possibility of turning the tables and, in the liberal world, actually using the same tactic against al-Qaeda?
I think that's dangerous territory, but that it ought to be explored. Now, I don't think it would be appropriate for people sitting in Langley, Virginia, or GCHQ in Cheltenham to be penning Arabic poems for dissemination amongst the tribes. But I think what we could do is encourage and collect poetry which is naturally produced in these environments and bring it together into volumes in the same way that al-Qaeda or Islamic State does. I think that there's an opportunity to actually consolidate what's already being produced, and the kind of messaging that is anti-militant jihad could actually be brought out in a far more compelling way than it currently is.
Elisabeth Kendall, and her book 21st Century Jihad is out now. This is BBC Radio 3. I'm Rana Mitter, and you're listening to Free Thinking.